Well, welcome to the Beyond the Youth Room podcast. I'm your host, Keith Seymour, and this is
Ryan Cottle.
And we're here to talk to you today about the important aspect of discipleship multiplication. So this is not just entertaining students. This is not just meeting until they graduate. This is really focusing on making disciples and multiplying disciples in our youth ministry. So stay tuned for today's lesson. All right, so today we're again talking about discipleship multiplication. Before we get into that, I'd like to talk about Edge Clubs, who is sponsoring this podcast. We have a free training that you can download, free training manual that you can download at our website, edgeclub.org. You can head over there, and one of the ways that we've really benefited from even discipleship multiplication in our own youth ministry is sending students out to be missionaries to their own schools. We've used Edge Club strategies in our own youth ministry and invite you to do the same. So when it comes to discipleship multiplication, there's a tendency in youth ministry to get kind of comfortable at entertaining students, to meet without really accomplishing what the necessary thing is for us as Christians, the lasting mandate of Christ to make disciples. I always use this analogy that I heard from some Dare to Share folks is if I were to tell my son, Hudson, my oldest, hey, listen, I'm going to the store. When I come back, I want you to have made your bed. So if I go to the store and I come back, what's the first thing I'm going to ask him?
Did you make your bed?
Yeah. And what if he's like, no, well, I did the dishes. Is that a bad thing? No. But did you make your bed is the first thing that I'm going to ask him, right? And he might say, well, I picked up the toys, like, my brother's, whatever. It's like, okay, well, that's still good, but did you make your bed? Now, he could also do something bad. It's like, I punched my brother instead. It's like, well, okay, that's bad and that's wrong. But at the end of the day, like sometimes a good thing can replace what's the best thing that we're called to do. And so in the same way, Jesus, when he left this earth, he said, make disciples. And when he comes back, what do you think he's going to ask us?
Did you make disciples?
But we had awesome Christian radio stations. Our Christian radio station's bad, by the way. Not a bad thing. But is it making disciples? Like, is it the thing that, that Jesus has told us? Like, we had, did you see our youth room? Mm-hmm. Like, we had awesome couches. Like, we had the best sound system. It's like, yes, but did you make disciples? And when it comes down to it, this is an important key aspect. Like one of the most important, actually, aspects of what our ministry should be about is how are we making disciples? How are we multiplying God's kingdom through making disciples who make disciples? And so part of that is what we use is the 4-chair model. So that's the discipleship multiplication model that we use. And you have a lot of experience with it as well. So tell us a little about, for someone that's new to the 4-chair model, or maybe they just need a refresher, what is that and how has it helped your ministry?
Yeah, so there are obviously a bunch of different disciple multiplication strategies, but the one that both of our ministries use is 4-chair, the 4-chair model by Dan Spader and his organization Like Jesus. And the 4-chair model, as Dan lays it out, says that everybody, and uses scripture to back it up, that everybody at some point in their life is sitting in one of 4 chairs from a spiritual standpoint. So you have chair 1, which is the lost, the unbeliever, so somebody who does not yet know Christ as their Savior. This could be somebody who's been in church their entire life but never made a decision to give their life to Christ. Somebody who's never heard the gospel, they would be in chair 1, both of them, because they've never made that decision. So once somebody trusts Christ, they've gone from death to life, they're now in chair 2, which is believer. So believer is somebody who has trusted Christ. They've given him their lives. They have placed their faith in his sacrifice for us. But they're still kind of a baby Christian in which, as Paul says, they're still on milk. They're still having to be fed constantly to learn what does this look like. And again, that could be somebody who just came to Christ yesterday. That could be somebody who's been in church their entire life and has given their life to Christ. But there's somebody who is still, we're focusing on them. They're not yet turning out and really focusing on bringing up others. As Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. Yeah. So then we have chair 3, which is the worker. So these are the people, think of the people who have given their life to Christ. They have been able to start to feed themselves and learn what God has for them. And they're serving in your ministry or serving in their community. They're serving others in one area or another. So they are participating in the ministry that is happening on some level. And then lastly, we have chair 4, which is disciple maker, which goes beyond just serving. And this is somebody who is bringing other people through those chairs. So this is somebody who is equipping other people to serve, equipping other people to go and share the gospel and sharing the gospel themselves, obviously, with those around them. So that's, again, you won't find chair 1, 2, 3, and 4 in Scripture, but you will see it modeled in the way that Jesus brought along his disciples from unbelief to the people who established the church and took the gospel to the known ends of the world at that time.
Yeah. And now someone who is new to this, they might have some questions, right? So how do you actually know what chair your student's in? Like, do you literally ask them to come in and say, hey, these are the chairs that you're sitting. You have your youth room divided into the 4 chair sections, and they have to sit in. Like, how do you actually know where your students are in the process? And then how do you actually encourage them to quote move up chairs, as they progress into the discipleship model?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this in our podcast on outcomes and what you measure. So we touched on a little bit there, but so go back and check that out if you haven't already. But the way we do it is through surveys. And so the students, like Jesus, they have an actual survey. That's the 4-chair survey, 4-chair assessment. And we have students take that quarterly. And so it's self-assessed, and it's just they put their name on it, but it doesn't get shared with anybody else other than myself. And it's just a way for them to kind of be honest about where they are in their life, and we can see where they are. There's other ways you can do it. You can explain the 4 chairs and have students just say where they think they are, but the problem with that is often we don't have the best perception of ourselves. And so I found instead of just saying, hey, what chair do you think you're in, you'll get a lot of kids who are like, well, I'm definitely in chair 4. And it's like, okay, well, have you ever shared the gospel and somebody trusted Christ? Well, no. Well, then you're not in chair 4. And
disciple,
and it again, you're not less valuable. So to God, we're all still made in his image, but helping them to see that themselves. So it's really valuable, especially doing the surveys. And we teach on it. We try and do it about yearly to where we're explaining, hey, this is the growth track we see you on. And so, if you take this and you see you're in chair 2, that doesn't mean that, well, I'm just in chair 2. It's like, no. We want to move you through. We're actually going to equip you and help you do this. You just have to be willing to, yield to what God is calling you to. So self-assessed surveys are the best way to do it. And
then how frequently do you do them?
We do them quarterly.
Okay,
quarterly. So you can do them semesterly too. Honestly, I think it depends.
Wait, did you just say semesterly?
Is that a word? Is that a word?
I don't know.
Every semester.
It is now.
Yeah. But, it depends a little bit on the turnover in your youth group. You might even want to do them more often than that, depending on, the area you live in and how often kids are coming and going. But I found quarterly to be the best way to kind of get a pulse, and is long enough out to where, it's not like the last week. So it's the same stuff. But it allows you to make changes too. If you all of a sudden get an influx of, non-believers in your ministry, you'll see that. And now we can kind of say, I had plans for this. Instead, we're going to do this. It allows you to kind of be flexible with that.
Well, and even in our own ministry, we're making sure that it's they say language is culture. So so even developing the language around the knowledge of the 4 chairs with our leaders has been crucial.
Yeah.
So to help them understand the differences and where they perceive students to be, not in a judgmental way, but just in an assessment way of okay, we want to evaluate where you are so that we can help you to get to the next level in your faith. I think that's been the biggest shift to really hone in on a menu-based approach to ministry. It's here's what all we offer. It's but now we have a map, where it's okay, this is a map that you can go along to understand okay, this is how you get from one chair to another. And so with that, we want to have the idea of even the highest percentage of what chairs in our youth ministry, because that changes how we interact with students in a large group setting. It changes maybe the topics that we discuss in our teachings, or the passages that we discuss. So when we did surveys, it really helps us to know that there's a highest percentage in chair 2. Okay, well, you're going to preach differently to chair 2 students that are it's majority of your students are chair 2.
Yeah.
You're going to really be calling them to action to grow in their faith. And as opposed to, it's you have the highest percentage of chair 1. Well, you're going to be sharing the gospel in a more intentional way, because that most of the students aren't coming from a faith background of knowing Christ. And so when it comes down to it, we want to make sure that we're encouraging students towards that discipleship path, rather than just the menu that I can choose from of coming to different events and youth group. We have a clear path that this is reflecting in how you are progressing in your walk with the Lord. Now, as far as percentages, is there any recommendation on what percentage we should have. Like, in other words, like say you survey students and you find out the percentages, and how do you even know what's good or bad, or, what you should improve on? Where should you go from there if you do these surveys?
Yeah, well, they've done research and found in our community at large, all it takes is about 10% of true believers to really shift the culture. And so if you have 10% of your students who are in chair 4, you'll see it. You'll notice it. It will shift the culture.
So that's a healthy
drastically.
minimum goal.
Yeah.
Of,
And it's not to say, again, if you survey and you're under that, it's not to say you don't have a healthy ministry. It just means you might need to shift the priorities that you're focusing on in order to, to get students there. The other thing is, if you have 0 in chair 1, well, that's a problem too then, because if we have chair 4, we'll always have chair 1, because those are the students who are really bringing others along. And now there's not necessarily a minimum percentage of that, right? But if you do a survey and you don't have anybody who says, yeah, I'm not sure I believe this yet, then hey, we've got a big problem, because then we're just a country club. We're not inviting others in. Yep. And that number might fluctuate as well.
Sure.
But yeah, I've often found our base is generally chair 2 and chair 3. And then, we've got some chair 4s. And then there's been seasons where, we've had half our kids as, self-assessing as chair 1. And that looked a lot different, than other seasons. And that was really, really cool. And you see huge harvests, and then you see kind of a planting and sowing. And that's kind of how youth ministry works sometimes. Yeah. But it really allows you to kind of touch the buttons to shift that where it needs to go.
Yeah. Well, and I think even just breaking down the simplicity of making disciples, we overcomplicate things, I think, in our Christian culture, where we think that it has to be this elaborate, massive plan, and like, okay, there's all these different aspects of it. And really, when you talk to people like that are in some of the fastest growing, church populations like in the world, like it's like, okay, what is your secret? Like, what's your strategy? They're like, we told people about Jesus. They know Jesus now. And now we just started a church. And it's like, tell us more. It's like, we did that again. and so it's like this, like Matt, it's like we think that it's like, oh, it's this certain strategy or this, and of course there's practical steps, because the difference between like a goal and accomplishing that goal is usually a pathway, like a clear like idea of how to accomplish that. And so through that is like, one, just, obviously identifying students where they are so that you can know where to help them along the way. But there's tons of resources in, Dan Spader's book and even like his organization, like they have tools of evaluating and kind of showing a dashboard of where your students are. Like all that stuff is phenomenal resources. But the idea there is making disciples is kind of 2-part, right? So it's evangelism. So taking a student from chair 1 to chair 2 by just literally sharing the gospel with them and helping them to respond to that, give an invitation to do so. But then the discipleship aspect of making disciples is, we often think that like it's just like a Bible study and like really just teach them, but it's really, there's 2 aspects of it. There's relational discipleship, and then there's didactic or teaching type of discipleship. And we want to have both of those, right? We want to relationally be sharing the core truths of the Christian faith, educating them, equipping the saints on how to live it out. And sometimes it literally just means like, okay, this is a study Bible. Like it has notes in the bottom, like that you can, there's commentary that you can help understand the passage more. Like, do you have a study Bible? No. Well, that's your first step. Like, just give a student like a nice study Bible. And then, there's cross references. Like if you want to learn a certain topic, like there's this thing called a concordance in the back, and you can look at, so just like literally, because someone did it for us, right? I mean, they taught us how to actually like read your Bible. So what do? Do you play Bible roulette, where you just flip open the Bible and say, this is what I'm reading today? And it's like, no. Like we have Bible reading plans. Like, you can actually read this. And if you do this every day, you'll actually read through the whole Bible in a year, or whatever the context is. And so when it comes down to it, start them off by just explaining the basis of discipleship. Like sometimes that's overcomplicating to us, and it shouldn't be, right? It's just simplicity of teaching them to obey the things that you've learned yourself. And so when it comes down to that discipleship multiplication model, the key is not to just have addition, right? We want to have that multiplication, and we can't do that on our own. So I think we've even when I started off in youth ministry, over 20 years ago, there was definitely an attractional model to youth ministry. It was like, if you build it, they will come. Like, and it was the Field of Dreams model. It's like, okay, we're gonna build this huge youth room and like have video games and have outreach events. And there was like a running joke. It's like, who can shoot a poodle out of a cannon the furthest? That's who's gonna get the most kids at their youth group on Wednesday. And then we'd give away an or iPads didn't really exist back then. But the thing is, as we talked before, it's like what you win them with is what you win them to. But if you focus on discipleship multiplication and addition, like you want to obviously see kids come to Christ through giving gospel invitations every week, but you want to see that multiplication because it's impossible to reach the world for Christ without multiplication. Like we can't just add everybody to our youth groups, and so there's some math that we were just talking about here on if we saw like 10 evangelists, like a Billy Graham evangelist style, like just leading 1,000 people every single day to the Lord. If we saw 10 of those every single day, it would take 1,753 years to see the world's population, and that's if no one else was born, to see the world's population come to Christ, or to hear the gospel. And then as opposed to a multiplication strategy, 10 disciples reproducing one person each year. So if you just took 10 people and you said, hey, next year, like by next year, you're going to have one more disciple that you're going to have trained. They'll in turn train someone else and disciple them. So by year 1, you'd have 20 disciples. Year 5, 320. Year 10, 10,240. Year 15, 320, 7,680. Which 15 years in, you're only talking about 300,000 people, which is like not even a drop in the bucket compared to the like almost 8 billion people that we have on Earth. But then it starts to compound, right? So by year 20, you have 10,485,760. By year 25, you have 544,320 disciples. And then by year 30, 10.7 billion people would have heard the gospel, like we multiply out. So when it comes, which is more than our population right now. So when we have this idea of multiplication, that is like a key ingredient for spreading the gospel. Like it can't just be adding. It can't just be how many students can fit in your youth room. It has to be a grassroots effort to equip them to multiply. And so through that, we want to make sure that our students are getting that 4-chair discipleship, multiplication aspect. And I think you were one of the ones there, but we did this thing at a local. It was several churches that got together, and we had a winter camp. And I was speaking at it, and we had the auditorium with students in it, and we just to illustrate it, I said, okay, I'm gonna personally try to tag each of you on the shoulder, and when I tag you on the shoulder, I want you to stand up. And the audience in unison all counted, in seconds, just 1, 2, which was a lot harder than I expected to get everybody in unison. But they counted, and I literally ran until I was like completely out of breath, like and tagged every single person on the shoulder. They stood up, and we stopped counting when they stood up. And out of the auditorium of students there, it took I think it was 186 seconds or something like that they counted to before everybody was standing. So then I said, okay, we're going to try this. So that's addition, right? That's just me adding every single person to the standing crowd. Then we tried multiplication, where I tagged first person. They in turn tagged everybody that they could. Every person that was tagged was now a tagger. Like they could go around and tag people. And we all still counted in unison, which is challenging when you're trying to do this and count at the same time in unison. And it took 16 seconds for everybody to stand. And so when it came down to it, we can speed up the discipleship process, the multiplication process of people knowing Christ by discipling towards 4-chair disciplers, right? We want to see them multiplying disciples themselves. And even some of the kind of historical Christian figures of the faith, they understood that, the early disciples. I mean, there was really 11 of them that finished the discipleship training of Jesus, and now we have the amount of Christians we have because of those first 11 people multiplying, not just adding, right? They train people who train people who train people. And so with that, we want to make this a core ingredient of our youth ministries so that students understand this is the normal Christian life. Coming every Sunday and sitting comfortably in a congregation, listening to the sermon, evaluating preferences of how comfortable the seats were or how far away your parking spot was to the church building. That's not the normal Christian life. When we look in the book of Acts and the early church, the normal Christian life was multiplying disciples, literally recreating yourself in other people. Even the Great Commission, Matthew 28, was said to disciples. When he said make disciples, they're like, make more of us. Like that's literally what like it would translate to, because they were disciples. So he's like, make disciples of all nations, make more of yourselves, reproduce spiritually. And I love Dawson Trotman. He had a really great book called Born to Reproduce, where he parallels that. He's like, if there was something wrong with physical reproduction, like you would know that you can't reproduce physically because if something was wrong. In the same way, if we can't reproduce spiritually, there's something wrong. Like we want to make sure that we are reproducing spiritual disciples into other people. Now, when we have this focus in our ministry, it seems like we can become legalistic, where we're kind of labeling students, seemingly like from the outside, when parents or like other students are like, well, they're 4-chair, they're 3-chair, and I'm just 2-chair. Like, and you're doing this comparison thing. So what are some of the dangers that we need to protect ourselves against when it comes to implementing a model like this?
Yeah. I think first, always understanding that, hey, there's salvation and then good works follow. And so it's not good works precede salvation. Our works are like filthy rags before we've come to know Christ. But understanding, as James says, if I have faith, I will have works. Yeah. And so people who say, well, this isn't really healthy for you to be holding people accountable, well, then Scripture's unhealthy. Now, again, we want to be careful and sensitive. The biggest thing is not placing somebody's worth or value based on what they do from a ministry standpoint, because that's not what God does. And so as long as we create space for those who say, maybe explicitly or not, that's not really what I want to do, as long as we're still making space for them. And not just like making space like a corner in the room, but like, hey, yeah, no, you're still here. You're still a big part of this. But we're never going to stop calling you to something. Yeah. I actually, I had a parent, we asked kids to pray out loud. But I tell them, I say, you can say no. Like, like kids are like, I'm like, no. If you want to say no. Like, I don't ask them in front of everybody individually. And I had a parent reach out and they're like, hey, my son's just not really comfortable. And he gets kind of uncomfortable when you ask him if he'd be willing to pray. And I said, that's fine. I get it. I said, but we always tell him that you don't have to. And I told her too, I said, I'll be respectful of that and more mindful of that. I said, but it doesn't mean I'm going to stop asking him. I didn't go like that night and be like, all right, hey, you're going to pray. Yeah. It's monster. Yeah. But for people to understand, like, no, it's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to continue to challenge, but making room for them. And then number two, we want to, just like our faith is between us and God, there are public parts of our faith, but there's some intimate things that are between us and God. And so for these students, I mean, we can see who's really living it out. That's obvious. But it's not like we have a chair 2 small group and it's like, okay, all of you are going to be together. No, that's not healthy. Yeah. That's not what we want. We don't have name tags that say anything like that. We don't distinguish them in any way other than it's just between them and God, and we get a window in to see that. But I mean, it's evident. But at that point, we don't identify them by where they are. Yeah. But we're always going to call them further, and that's what we're commanded to do.
Yeah. Well, and I remember just challenging even middle school students to like raise to the occasion as far as like challenging them in a deeper level to come up. So just like we don't talk to babies like babies. Like sometimes we, a cute, like goo goo gaga way, but if they only heard baby talk, they would never learn the proper language, like how to say things. Like we need to expose them to adults talking in a regular way so that they learn the language. Yeah. In the same way, like if you're not quite there, like that's okay. You're always welcome. Like even non-believers, like you're welcome to be here. But that's not going to keep us from, calling you to higher ground, like to really focus on growing in the Lord. And I don't think we should apologize for that. Like we that's our role as youth leaders, is to call students to action and call students to grow and walk with the Lord. I think we can do that in a performance-based way that can be unhealthy, where we're again, like your value, or like you're only getting special attention if you're this way or whatever. Like, no, like we want to make sure that we're cautious of that. But yeah, we shouldn't be apologetic of calling students to walk with Lord closer and to be more mindful of growing in a pathway towards closeness to Jesus. Like, I don't think that should ever be a bad thing. And so with that, we can definitely do them a disservice if we're not doing that, right? So if we're just preaching or talking or teaching to the lowest common denominator of like what their understanding is of the Bible, then we can be doing a disservice for students that want to be challenged and then rise to the challenge. One of the things I saw that too was I was challenged years ago by some mentors to really test the limits of even middle school students. So I was the middle school pastor at our largest location at our church, and we started teaching. It was an optional class, so it wasn't just like our main programming, but it was an optional discipleship class that they could come, and we taught through systematic theology. I was like, we didn't even like call it something like cool, or it was just like systematic theology discipleship class, and we taught like on like the core elements of systematic theology to middle school students, and I was shocked. The room was packed, but also like they were raising their hands, asking questions like, "So Christology, like, what do you mean by the the incarnation of Christ versus like being fully God and man?" It's like they were understanding it at a deeper level than I anticipated, and I think we sell the students short when we don't really challenge them to like, in other words, we might be talking baby language to younger people, and they can really understand more than we expect. Now, as far as focus and attention, that might be another thing, but I think their comprehension can be a lot deeper than we anticipate. Their focus is often overestimated, I believe, in our youth ministries. But with that though, what are some obstacles that you've seen as you've implemented, for chair discipling or discipleship multiplication? What are some oppositions, maybe even spiritual oppositions that you've experienced as you've really focused on that, and then how can we overcome those?
Yeah, I think the first is our own perception. I remember vividly, it was our winter retreat 2 years ago, and there was a group of guys that I really thought like these are the ones that are really gonna be the core of what God wants us to do here. And I remember just being frustrated because they were not focusing on what God was clearly calling them to. And I remember just laying in my bunk, at like 2 a.m. because that's things we do as youth leaders, like, waiting for everybody to fall asleep. And I was just laying there, and it's the clearest I've ever heard God like give me any thought or say anything to me. And it was, Ryan, I didn't pick the ones everybody expected me to pick, so why would you? And it was just like, whoa, like, and so I think first is our own perception of, am I limiting people from really rising to the occasion because I'm saying, well, you don't look like what I think, this should look like. Yeah. I was actually talking to another student the other day, and he was saying how he was surprised this group of students from his school started coming to youth group, and he was shocked to see them. Yeah. And it was a good conversation and in good spirit, and it was open, so I kind of pushed a little bit. I said, can I ask you a question? He was like, yeah. I said, how long have you been coming to youth group? He was like, a long time. I was like, yeah, this kid's a junior, 7 years. I said, how many, friends have you brought to youth group in those 7 years? And he was like, maybe like 3. I said, you know how much how many students that group has brought in the past month? He was like, a lot. I was like, 15. Not even believers yet. Like they don't know anything other than like, wow, this seems like something I want my friends to know about. And some of them have gotten saved, but it was just a point of like, we don't limit anybody by saying you don't look like, or you don't talk like, or you don't act like, because obedience doesn't equal godliness. It follows it, but it doesn't equal it. And so we don't want to prejudge anybody. So I think first is our own perception. The second is just by understanding that, yes, there will be opposition when you do it. And so a lot of times when somebody, opposes that, we kind of see that as, well, I don't know, like I want to make sure, because a lot of times we confuse it to think that we're supposed to be peacekeepers, but God calls us to be peacemakers. So our job is not to keep peace amongst the status quo that is. Our job is to help God make peace with man and make sure that we're in right relationship. Yeah. And so when we understand that when we are getting pushback, we need to check ourselves first, but if we are not getting pushback, we might not be actually doing what God is calling us to do. Because look at the disciples and tell me which one of them didn't receive any pushback. Yep. They paid for it with their lives, all of them except John, obviously who was exiled. And so understanding that there might be pushback. And then lastly, I think is sometimes it can be hard if you as a student ministry are calling students to something that your church might not be calling parents to. Yeah. And so having grace for that and understanding that sometimes, as with every revival in history, as far as I have studied and understood, it starts with young people. It's normally not the older generation saying, we're doing pretty well, let's make sure that the young people know. No, there's normally a revival because there's a need for it. Yeah. And so understanding that sometimes you might have to lead as a student ministry by example and just simply saying, hey, not everybody might be here yet, but this is what we think God is calling us to, and setting that example for others to follow after.
Yep. For a brief season, I went from youth ministry and I was the associate pastor at our church. And in those 3 years that I led, what I observed about youth ministry compared to adult ministry is that students are more likely to actually do what you're asking them to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that was I was like, man, I got to get back into youth ministry, because I was like, this is such a crucial element. Where students, and maybe this is a positive thing, they don't have their full frontal cortex developed where they can make wise decisions. So capitalize on that, with teenagers now, to challenge them to do things that like adults normally wouldn't, as far as sharing the gospel, relationally risking, their friendships, to share the gospel with friends, to multiply them out, and so with that, there's definitely a huge idea behind youth ministry that's like, oh well, we don't want to challenge them, we don't want to have them feel uncomfortable if we ask them to do more than what we feel like they're capable of. But I feel like we limit them in many ways by doing that. We don't believe in them as much as the Lord can really use them, and so we don't want that our own belief in them to limit what the Lord can do through our ministries. When it comes to some of the stuff that we've been talking about as far as multiplying out, to develop that strategy, that discipleship multiplication strategy, one of the things that I've experienced is really helping parents to be challenged in that way too, as you mentioned, where and that's why you should have direct connections with parents, to be helping them to lead by example as well in this. But sometimes you'll see that students are doing it, and that's raising a friction, because the parents are like, wait, I'm not doing this, and so therefore I'm feeling embarrassed, or I feel, and then that's kind of some of the pushback that you see. They're challenging you. So some of the pushback that you might see when you're implementing this isn't always from a place of they don't like what you're doing. They're feeling embarrassed that they're not doing it themselves, and therefore, and we've seen it in leaders too. Other students that they're not really they're being uncomfortable, and their natural response is to push back. To, this is uncomfortable, so therefore this is not good. And so to help the students to embrace that culture of pushing past comfort to really fulfill the mission of Christ, I think is a huge aspect of it. What are some key takeaways that we can gather from today's lesson? Some practical steps that we've covered that if someone's just listened to this last portion, this conclusion, that they can just walk away with when it comes to discipleship multiplication.
Yeah, the power of multiplication. So understanding that traditionally a lot of ministry is done based on addition. Hey, bring your friends to youth group where I will share the gospel with them. Multiplication says, hey, here is the gospel, go share it with your friends. Secondly, not saying no or yes to anybody before God has the opportunity to offer it to them. So don't say no for anybody. That's not the person that really would do this, or I don't really see them as being a leader. Offer it. Say, hey, this is what we're going to challenge everybody to, and then those that rise to it, hey, God's made it clear in their lives. And then lastly, have a strategy. This isn't some ethereal thing of go and make disciples. No. God made it pretty clear, and that was his whole point. Yep. This is what it looks like to make disciples. Go and make disciples. So share the gospel. They trust. Teach them to obey all, baptize them. So help them to make that public and to take that next step, and then teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. Well, everything they've commanded is to go and make disciples and baptize. So it's just kind of that infinite circle that keeps growing and growing and growing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode, talking about discipleship multiplication. If you've received any value from this, we'd love to hear your feedback, and to really just share it with other youth leaders that might benefit from this as well. When you like and subscribe and comment, it helps all the algorithms, the different platforms to see our content, and we'd love for you to participate in that with us. And of course, if there's any other topics that you want covered in the future, please let us know. So thanks so much for joining us today.